Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President, and Sue Ann Weinberg, Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the New York Historical Society for our 9th annual Diane and Adam Emacs Conference on Women's History. And happy Women's History Month. Woo! Although, as we like to say, every month is Women's History Month at New York Historical, and sometimes every day is Women's History Month. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to thank Louise Mirror, our President and CEO, Agnes Sue Tang, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and Pam Schaffler, our Chair Emerita, as well as all of our trustees, along with Joyce B. Cowan, Jean Margot Reed, the Mellon Foundation, our Chairs Council, our members, and our many other generous donors. None of the work of New York Historical would be possible without their continued and committed support. As the founding director of the Center for Women's History, I am proud of the growth we've achieved since its inception. Our scholarship, education, programs, collecting, and not least of all, exhibitions, all foreground women's critical role in American history. This conference was the brainchild of Diane Max and her late husband, Adam, established in 2016 before the bricks and mortar of our center were even set. We are so grateful to the Maxes for their imagination and impetus to set this cornerstone of our work. 4 years ago today, the Max Conference honored the centennial of the passage of women's suffrage. Little did we know that a week or two later, the whole world would shut down and our lives would be forever changed. Since then, we've altered much of how we work, even how we stage programs like this one. I'm happy to see those of you who have shown up in person to our beautiful Robert H. Smith Auditorium, but I'm equally delighted that thousands more will have the benefit of seeing this conference remotely. Our theme this year is On and Off the Clock, Reconsidering Women's Work. According to the CDC, 2 out of every 3 caregivers in the United States are women. This imbalance became painfully clear after 2020 as COVID-19 lockdowns decimated women's workforce participation while dramatically increasing demands on professional and informal care workers. This brought into focus the ways that care has long been coded as work done by women, assumed to be rooted in instinct rather than skill. Over centuries, this gendered assumption has relegated the work of caring for the young, aging, sick, and disabled to the background of public life and obscured the ways that race, class, and power have coerced or compelled some women to bear the brunt of caring. Yet, this work, whether it is paid or unpaid, enslaved or free, performed by mothers or other caregivers, underpins the economy and is essential for continued human survival. Today, we're here to discuss the historical context shaping what care means. Who does the work of caring? What services get pushed to the margins by our current social policy framework? And how this is reflected in debates around reproductive care. Now, I'd like to turn things over to get started to Anna Danziger-Halperin, Associate Director of the Center. Anna.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and thank you all for being here. Before we jump into today's program, I wanted to give a little bit of background about how we came to today's theme. Care is a topic that's close to my own heart and scholarly interests. Before I was a historian, I was a public policy researcher on childcare, and my own scholarship centers on the history of debates around childcare. But care work is also a key theme to our exhibition upstairs in our 4th floor Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery, Women's Work. The exhibition, which is open through this coming August, uses our collections here at New York Historical to present a wide-ranging, non-exhaustive look at women's labor in New York over the past 300 years. It captures the breadth and myriad of women's experiences while challenging the stereotype invoked by the phrase women's work. Put bluntly, what we show is that while women's work is everywhere, there is no such thing as women's work as distinct from men's work. Women's work in all of its varied forms is and always has been real labor. It defies categorization and has been shaped not only by personal preferences, but by broad trends in American economic, legal, and political history. Within this wide lens, I would argue that nowhere do we see the historical persistence of gender stereotypes than in work that involves caregiving in its many forms, whether that work is within the formal labor market or outside of it. And when you layer in race, ethnicity, class, legal status, language, national origin, sexual orientation, gender presentation, our current care landscape has been shaped by deeply rooted assumptions about the value of care and about who provides that labor. If you have a chance to go upstairs, I invite you to explore the exhibition and find this through line for a variety of our objects, both ones that may seem more obvious, like a large mahogany cradle from the 1820s, or a volunteer nurse's armband from World War I, and ones that might appear less so, like a very small button from the National Welfare Rights Organization from the 1970s, or a photograph of a trans sex worker in the 1980s meatpacking district. So for today, our panel conversations are starting from questions that seem maybe kind of basic, but when you start to unravel them, reveal historical complexity. What is care and who performs it? Is care work? What happens when care is pushed to the margins, and what does care look like in the most intimate of settings? We've brought together experts from a variety of different time periods who specialize in different types of care and different groups of caregivers. So let's jump in. I'd like to invite the first panelists to join me on stage while I give some introductions. There are longer notes about our panelists' biographies in the program. I'm just going to give very briefly a sense of their many, many accomplishments. Our first panel is focusing on the tensions at the heart of caring work. And I want one note, we were thrilled that Tavolia Glimp was going to originally join us, but unfortunately she had to cancel for extenuating circumstances, and we hope to host her for another program soon. Emma Amador is an assistant professor of history at the University of Connecticut. Her forthcoming book is titled The Politics of Care, Puerto Ricans, Citizenship, and Migration After 1917. Rosel Pereñas is the Doris Stevens Professor in Women's Studies and Professor of Sociology and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Princeton. Her research examines the labor and transnational migration of domestic workers from the Philippines, and she is completing a book titled The Trafficker Next Door: How Domestic Employers Abuse Forced Labor. Sherry Randolph is a professor of history at the Georgia Institute of Technology and founder of the Black Feminist Think Tank. She's author of the award-winning book, Florence Flo Kennedy, The Life of Black Feminist Radical, and a forthcoming book titled Bad Black Mothers, A History of Transgression. Our moderator, Sarah Luderman, is the caregiving reporter for The 19th, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom focused on women and gender. Please welcome me in joining them, and welcoming them.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists. I'm going to start with what may seem like a very basic question. The title of this panel is Who Cares? So let's open with that idea. What is care work? Who does care work in our society? What factors shape precisely who cares? Let's start with Dr. Pereñas.
So let me start by thanking the Society for inviting me to participate. So I want to respond with what is seemingly an equally basic response. So as the first speaker of our symposium today, I wanted to start with just a working definition of care. So care, in its most basic sense, is the work, it's the labor of ensuring the well-being of others in society. In sociology, we've even narrowed that down even more, where people follow the definition provided by the economist Nancy Fulbray and the sociologist Paula England, and they look at care as specifically referring to the face-to-face labor of sustaining the well-being of others, and this would include teachers, nurses, nannies. But for me, that definition is slightly too narrow, and I often actually move away from the word care, as I prefer the term reproductive labor, as I feel that that term encompasses a wider range of the work that sustains the well-being of others. I'm a huge fan of the work of Mignon Duffy, who even further clarifies that we should be very attuned to and aware that there are like what she calls nurturant reproductive labor and non-nurturant reproductive labor. And to answer the question, it's so important to make that distinction because as we know, reproductive labor or care work is being increasingly outsourced. But that outsource, and it's done by women, but in that outsourcing, hierarchies emerge and nurturant reproductive labor is often those that are preferred to be less outsourced, and the work that's often outsourced is what we can call non-nurturant reproductive labor. And this work of sustaining the well-being of others would be the work that people tend not to want to do, and that's like vacuuming, doing laundry, cleaning dirt, and that outsourced work is often done by those in the margins of society, which in the US would be Black women and women of color, particularly Latinx women.
Dr. Randolph, would you like to go next?
Hello. Okay. So interestingly, my work. So I do reproductive in terms of. Flo Kennedy was a lawyer for the first case that was rolled up into Roe v. Wade that happened here in New York that helped to legalize and decriminalize abortion. So I'm writing one book that's on looking at Black women in that work, right, through Dobbs, right, Roe through Dobbs. And then the work that I do on Bad Black Mothers actually looks a bit differently at artists and who are mothers, but who choose to in some ways unmother themselves because of this very question of reproductive labor that falls heavily on women and in connection to how we think of the accessibility of abortions from whomever, from the Hyde Amendment on. So abortion was steadily, as someone who does a historian of the legal history of reproductive justice and reproductive labor, it has been steadily chipped away. So Dobbs isn't surprising, steadily chipped away at the same time that voting rights was chipped away. So part of what my work does in understanding care is how Black women, especially artists like Alice Walker, Camille Billups, in the face of having children pre-Roe, negotiated care work and trying to be artists in the midst of that. And some of these women, Carrie Mae Weems also, and especially for Black women in the history of, and people often ask me this, like, what is the history of Black women, like historians, not sociologists? And most of that history on motherhood is done through welfare rights and so forth, which helps to inform what I do. And as historians, we often, in, say, the Black freedom movement, will do the other mothers, right? That actually comes from political scientists, but, we take on everybody's children, right? Just look at us and we'll mother you. Like in the mammy image and so forth, right? This, and so my work kind of looks at these few, but remarkable women who transgress that definition of the kind of the uneven plight of family making that falls heavily on women even after they become mothers, right? And so, for example, with Alice Walker, I don't know how, I've just put all of her work in order. I don't know why no one had never done this. That's all she talks about in her early work is this is impossible. You can't be an artist who thinks at any time of the day and try to create art and care for a small child, because one, they have to eat. There's things you can't deny, and it weighs very heavily. And then I also look at, especially in the way I was able to see this work was in the pandemic. I have a small child, and I was like, what the? There's just nothing. And everyone, I tell this story of how I came to the Bad Black Mothers Project. I was right before the pandemic, and my son had a pacifier in his mouth, and an unhomed person first hit on me, asked for money, and then reprimanded me as a bad mother. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I was like, what? Why does your son have a pacifier? And I left with the pacifier, like, I guess I got to take him off the pacifier. Like, the fact that he could command that power, I was really intrigued by. That everyone had access to the power to reprimand me and police me into place. And so I look at women who defied that reprimanding of labor, right? Of the family making that, it often falls on women and unevenly falls on Black women, even if they revolt against it. The jobs that are available to women are also often in caregiving, whether nursing, teaching, so forth. So I'm interested as a historian in the question of women who circumvented, deviated, tried to navigate despite the clause of having children in now we can even say in a post-jobs, because I live in the South, so we know what's going on in terms of that, but also in a pre-Roe moment. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I also had a baby during the pandemic, and so I really feel that that story, and also thinking about the ways that my work, and I'm writing a book on the politics of care and the way that Puerto Rican women have organized around care and caring labor in different historical moments, both in Puerto Rico and in the Puerto Rican diaspora, largely in New York. And one of the things that really has struck me about doing that work during this moment of kind of transformation that we've been in with the pandemic is, just how political and personal it feels to do that work while stealing time, literally, to write. One of the things that I am really interested in is the way that care is something that Puerto Rican women have organized around in ways that has been both liberatory and also coercive to other women based on class and race, and thinking about within Puerto Rican communities, struggles over demanding care, especially within a context of colonization, a context of kind of differential rights for Puerto Ricans, both in the context of the archipelago, where Puerto Ricans are colonized citizens with different kinds of rights to care because Social Security has been extended only partially and only provisionally, and so how that becomes a space of organizing. But also then what happens when Puerto Ricans come to the US and experience also being second-class citizens here, and how they try to make a life. And for many of the kind of actors that I was looking at, one of the ways that they found to mobilize to support their communities was through organizing together in a labor context, so demanding labor rights as domestic workers, or also joining things like the welfare rights movement and finding connections with other communities and communities of color in the US to try to struggle for broader social provisioning. And so that's kind of some of the questions that I'm looking at. One of the struggles that I find, and I think, other panelists are going to be talking about this more today, is how that, the ways in which that organizing demands transformations in the state, right? How can we get the state to recognize social reproduction, to support it in some way? So I see a lot of, women struggling for broader social welfare protections, or for food programs, or for kind of basic coverage, or for labor protections for domestic workers. How can we organize in that way? But then also, and I know, Premalyn Addison is here as well, and I'm just rereading her wonderful book on care, the limitations also of a state-focused approach and the frustration with the lack of response by the state is something that I deal with a lot. So I also see the women actors that I'm really interested in becoming infuriated with that path and seeking to create alternatives, often through mutual aid collectives, through rejecting kind of the basic logic that women should be carers, or thinking about how to envision care kind of politically or philosophically in a way that maybe goes beyond gender, binaries, or that opens up kind of questions of how can we live in a world where we recognize interdependence, but also fight for our ability to be artists and be creators, and that's a real struggle. So I would say my kind of the dream for my work that I have right now is really to think about the way that care is both a space of political organization, but also how it can sometimes backfire, because organizing through the state can be a challenge, but also there are differences among the groups that I'm looking at. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this next question, I think you've touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to dig into it more. What are some of the gaps in the history of caregiving that aren't being addressed and that you hope will be filled in the future? Dr. Prenyas, if you'd like to start.
Can you ask the question again?
What are some of the gaps in the history of caregiving that aren't being filled currently and that you hope will be filled in the future? Like, where are some of the spaces where work needs to be done?
Like research?
Yes.
Okay. I was like, so I know this is the Historical Society, but I'm a sociologist of contemporary experiences. So when the word history comes up, you're like, huh? Like history? But just in terms of caregiving and where the work that needs to be done, I mean, I think we need a lot of work still on like many things. Like I think philosophically, what is care work? I mean, care work is so paradoxical. Care work basically is the least valued, but at the same time, the most valued work in society. It's the least valued materially, but it's the most valued emotionally. And we need more philosophical works that dig into that paradox and the meanings of that paradox and how that manifests in everyday experiences. And so to answer your question then more directly, that paradox for me, what it's really led to is this constitution of care work as a familial responsibility. And that construct of care work as familial responsibility actually then manifests in the legal status of migrant domestic workers globally, not only in the United States, and we need more research on this. So this is a fact. Across the globe, with the exception of Italy, because of its strong union history, migrant domestic workers or migrants whose legal status is tied to their employment as a domestic worker are indentured servants. So across the globe, domestic workers are indentured workers or bound workers whose legal status is contingent on their sole employment as a live-in worker for a family. And because they're not seen as real workers, but as family members. And so this legal status then is very hard to get out of. And so in certain countries, you need the actual permission of your sponsor to quit your job. In other countries, they only give you like 2 weeks to find a new employer before you can then not get deported. And so where is this status? Like, where does the status exist? United States, we see this in the status of au pairs, domestic workers of diplomats. We see this in Denmark, and I mention these countries because these places are idealized, right, for their caregiving, but we see this in au pairs in Denmark, we see this in Taiwan, and in Taiwan you actually can never quit your job unless your employer is deemed by the state no longer fit to employ you, which would happen if they died or declared bankruptcy. This is also the case in Turkey. So we think of this like Malaysia, I said Singapore. So we think of this as a status that domestic workers only have in the Middle East, but it's actually like pervasive globally. And I feel like we don't focus enough on this precarious legal status that then lends itself to the likely human trafficking of domestic workers across the world.
Yeah, I I think I was so many things. That was such a great point. I've been thinking about just in terms of my own graduate students and what they're interested in, and oftentimes you'll have them run off, and you're like, show me the history of this. What's the historiography? And they're like, there's nothing. And I'm like, wow, how is this? It's like in 2025. But definitely the history of, carcerality as it mixed with childcare. I have a grad student who's looking at, which was very common, especially here in New York, so you all will understand this, like leaving your child with a neighbor or just leaving your child at home while you have to work a third shift, right? Taking care of someone else's children or doing, you're a medical aide and so forth. And her project looks really at those children who often experience, rape or neglect, or and then the mom becomes criminalized in another way because of that. So I would love to see definitely like the repercussions of, a failed liberal state, where it kind of starts pushing against the wall and comes back to the front of the line and the back of the line, which is always women and family, And I experience that in my work because I look at women who reject it, and I'm like, how did you reject this? There's so much pressure from everyone for you to. So, for example, with Camille Billups, she gives her child up for adoption at 4. She's like, no, we're good here. I want to go travel, and that's unheard of, especially for Black women. And she gives her up, and literally her friends try to have her arrested. Right, which is interesting because usually the state will take your kids, but they try to have her arrested, and there's no charge for that. But the idea that a Black woman who's not like a drug addict or whatever would reject motherhood, and also to give to the state, which we would deem as, especially a lot of adoption agencies, even this was in the 60s. Would not even accept Black children, So this is the first front of accepting Black children, or they would accept them just to put them in some sort of labored, indentured servitude. So just understanding the limited, if we're going to use the word choice, the limited choice even inside the choices, right? So more work on that, I'm becoming much more curious about.
Yeah, I would say so. As far as scholarship, but also just attention, one thing that is extremely difficult for me in doing my work, so I'm Puerto Rican, was born in Puerto Rico, but grew up in the diaspora, is just the erasure of the colonial contours of U.S. history. So this is kind of specific to my work, but I think it also really highlights some of the erasures that we have around kind of the larger history of colonial racial capitalism in our scholarship and history, and also more broadly, not thinking about how the extraction of the kind of lives, labor, bodies, work from other places has fueled the growth of this place. And there are wonderful scholars here who talk about that. But also, that the ramification of that colonial project in Puerto Rico has been so deeply felt in recent years with, Hurricane Maria, the austerity measures that are happening in Puerto Rico. The question of the welfare state in a colonial context is a question of life or death, and people are losing that battle. And so when I look at the kind of activism of people around those questions, it also breaks my heart to see how much the kind of divestment in supporting rebuilding efforts in Puerto Rico has been, and how much people have mobilized and organized to try to respond to that. So the erasure of US colonialism within scholarship kind of fuels also the realities that we're living with, which is that the US still doesn't see itself as an empire. So that would be one thing. Another thing that I see a lot in my work kind of mirrors what my fellow panelists have said, which is really that so many of the actors that I look at historically, whether it's in the 1910s, the 1930s, or afterwards, were really living in an experience of almost indenture, right? That where they're there was an expectation that they would go to the United States to live and work in maybe an extended family member or for another family, and just were stripped of almost all of their rights. So I'm very interested in how do we write and think about that intergenerational legacy of kind of forced domestic labor, which hasn't been written about very much in the Puerto Rican and Latino context. And then the final thing I'll say, and we have great scholars here today who don't do this, but I think there's still an erasure of thinking about how women's participation and struggles around care work are central to the story of feminism in the United States, and how much economic justice questions and care work issues are a part of feminism. So it still seems, and I get this from teaching, that my students still are just struck when they learn about welfare rights or they learn about domestic, they think of feminism as something that was aside from these other struggles of working class women's stories. So we still have work to do, I think, to make the mainstream story of feminism that we're teaching one that captures those stories.
Dr. Amador, your forthcoming book is focused on Puerto Rican women's activism and the politics of care work. What are some of the ways that colonialism, particularly American colonialism, have shaped care work in the United States?
Yeah, well, I spoke, thank you for that question. I spoke a little bit just now, but we've had some really heartbreaking, why am I using heartbreaking so much today? Sorry, we've had some really disappointing Supreme Court cases, which some of you might have heard about, on a lot of levels. But when it comes to Puerto Rico, one of the issues is that as a U.S. territory, Puerto Rico is not covered under the U.S. Bill of Rights, is not covered under the same policies as the U.S. And so that has allowed differential funding and funding caps on basic programs like Medicare, supplemental security insurance. These programs don't cover Puerto Rico. This has created a really deep and lasting inequality on top of other kinds of, extraction of resources from Puerto Rico, has not allowed people to have access to some supports that would be really useful. And so this has been a big challenge. So my work looks at how, from the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935, Puerto Ricans have been fighting back against this, both for, some for independence for the archipelago, but others to demand that there be a closer form of, or equaler form of social rights there. And that has been a long battle that, with many losses, but also looking at it, can teach us about how people have organized and demand rights and dignity for over a century. And often on deaf ears. So I would say the question of policy, to me, is an important one that gets, I want the day-to-day struggle, but also the policy and legislation we desperately need changes to help Puerto Rico now.
Dr. Pereñas, in your book, Servants of Globalization, you talk about the globalization of mothering. For those who are unfamiliar, can you talk about the concept a little bit?
Okay, thank you for that question. So I look at the out-migration of Filipino domestic workers, and Filipino domestic workers can be found in more than 100 countries across the globe. And I have not seen the series Expat with Nicole Kidman, but people told me, oh, it's like they discovered Servants of Globalization 20 years later. So I guess in that series, there is a reference to something I talked about quite a while ago, and I called it the International Division of Reproductive Labor. And it focuses then, it highlights how the outsourcing of care work is passed on to women on a global stage. And the care work and its outsourcing really is dependent on the existence of less privileged women than ourselves. And so there is a chain-like relationship among women in which a woman with more privilege in a destination country is able to enter the workforce because there is a affordable domestic worker who they can hire to provide childcare for them. But this domestic worker can also only do this work because there is a even lesser paid domestic worker in the country of origin doing care work for them. And so the norm for migrant domestic workers is the vast majority of them are mothers. They're mothers because reproductive costs increase for them, and so they have a greater need to migrate when they have children. But perhaps not ironically, there is a preference for them by employers who want people with quote unquote natural affinities to do this work, right? And so this chain-like relationship of women commodifying care is not just salient in Filipino migrant communities, but it's a global phenomenon that affects migrant domestic workers, has been documented by other scholars in from Nicaragua, from Mexico, El Salvador, Poland, and oftentimes these mothers are actually vilified and seen as bad mothers who abandoned their children. So just to give you an example, the children of migrant mothers in Poland, for example, are referred to as Euro orphans, with the connotation being that the mothers care more about the euro than their children. Or in Romania, there are a lot of psychological studies saying that children of migrant mothers from Romania become deviant because of their mother's migration and displacement of care to another family. So I do want to add, though, that I found, I revisited this idea, and what's really depressing is this chain-like relationship among women continues upon retirement. So domestic workers is one of the groups of workers that are least likely to retire. We shouldn't be surprised. They're paid so little. They're often informal. They don't get Social Security. And so in my study, when I revisited the women I interviewed for Servants of Globalization, 20 years later, many of them had still not retired, sadly, and that many of them I found were actually, they transitioned from childcare when they were super young, and then when they're super old, they don't have the stamina to do that anymore, so they do elder care. So many of the people I interviewed for this book who are in their 70s and 80s are actually doing elderly caregiving and freeing then the children of the elderly they're caring for than to continue to pursue careers. And so it's a life cycle issue for domestic workers.
Dr. Randolph, you touched on this a little bit already, but historically in American culture, Black women have sort of been portrayed as uniquely, naturally suited to mothering and care work. This cultural legacy rooted in slavery has cast a long shadow. Today, Black women are overrepresented in fields like long-term care. Can you talk a little bit about the landscape that Black women in America find themselves in, and sort of how this came to be?
So there's the, and I deal with this a little bit in my book on bad Black mothers, kind of the stereotype of Black women. The mammy stereotype, really, they don't, who cares where their kids are, but, they mother are uniquely capable of caring for white women's children, right? We don't, in that stereotype, we don't care about their children. Where are they? Who cares? And then it's often used, when you do see them, the mammy character, in their home, they're emasculating, and that carries on. And then my work looks a little bit about the narratives that Black people help to create to challenge that, both real and imagined and true in many regards, to, if we look in the civil rights movement, the Black freedom movement, and so forth, this kind of backbone mother. So even women without children are thought of as mothers, like Rosa Parks, or even sometimes people would say, Flo Kennedy was the mother of Black feminism. Like, and she wasn't very maternal, had none of, just mentoring becomes, limiting. It becomes a way to limit activism, and also the way to see through your work is only shaped through that. Or the way Mamie Till and all of these, Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King's wife and so forth. And so I look at that stereotype, how it's created and maintained, and even limits Black women's care and choices and individual, and how really heteronormative family making is what we're looking at, right? Who it protects, who it allows to escape. And it's about that. And also, this gets back to your original question about historians, and I like that you said as opposed to research. These are, a lot of this work with Black women in care and women of color in care comes from sociology, right? And where historians come into this question is often with, like I said, welfare rights, or if you look at the Black freedom movement, it's around organizational, if we talk about that at all, right? And so some of what we see now coming from historians, especially along the lines of reproductive care, is challenging the definitions wholeheartedly of family making that is heteronormative and so forth, and looking at coalitions around certain questions. So with that, I'm thinking Kathy Cohen's question, like how to create, a coalition of deviants or anyone who's outside, right? And how Black women negotiated that with different issues from, in our current moment, which is, I have an article that I'm working on now, is looking at how Black women created coalitions around the Dobbs, the criminalization of abortion in our current era, and the rollback of voting rights that were happening in the same time simultaneously in the courts. But yet, so now you have coalitions that came up in that pandemic moment. I'm a reproductive voter, right, that we didn't see before, because people are making those connections that politically that all of this is connected. So I think, especially this generation of activists, I hope we see much more history, and not just, historians really looking at and research in general on the connections between this type of reproductive care that is sliced everywhere. We can see it in not only the double shift, the triple shift now that they're saying people do, women do when the double shift was they come home and they care and they cook and they get their kids ready, and the triple shift is the guilt they feel for going to work. And they stay on YouTube trying to, so like on Instagram trying to make themselves feel better, and not getting enough sleep and so forth. So hopefully, and what we are seeing is that, coalitions are coming together, addressing this moment in different groups that have been around for, decades, like Sister Song and so forth. Yeah.
Dr. Amador, what are some of the ways that organized labor has changed the landscape for domestic workers in the United States? How have domestic workers built their own power, particularly those from the Puerto Rican diaspora?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that I look at in my work is kind of the limitations of organized labor in the kind of New Deal moment, but then also how generations of women have struggled to kind of find a place in the labor movement over time, and we're kind of living with these gains and these struggles that are happening right now. When I look at the 1930s and the 1940s with kind of care workers and domestic workers from Puerto Rico, those workers, of course, were really left out of labor protections. And so a big part of the kind of story of Puerto Rican women's integration into the labor, into labor organizing was that it was easier to organize as needle workers or in other fields, but that the domestic workers were often left aside. However, that did not mean that they were not very militant and very organized in interesting ways. And in part, that goes to the kind of vibrancy of the kind of political world of Puerto Ricans at that time. There was a, really big socialist movement in Puerto Rico in the 30s and the 40s, and so women drew on those intellectual kind of strains in their own, in coming together once they were in New York to basically do work stoppages, right? One of the main ways that Puerto Rican women moved away from really terrible labor conditions that they faced in New York was just to leave certain jobs. And I first became interested in this because my grandmother was a domestic worker from Puerto Rico as a part of this wave, and she had walked out of some jobs to get others, and kind of told me her stories of what it was like to be a domestic in the 40s here, and I became interested in it. So they felt, that they didn't have access to that. But now, right, we live in a different landscape where we have this vibrant domestic worker movement all over the country, all over the world. Domestic workers are organizing for rights in really powerful ways and demanding protections. I think that one of the things that we're going to have moving forward is kind of thinking about how do we, again, grapple with these nuances and complexities of care. What can labor policy do for us, right? How can it help workers versus how do we challenge or deal with the fundamental issue of social reproduction as creating gendered biases, creating different forms of repression against certain women, right? So we're living with kind of the wonderful stories of vibrancy of labor organizing and also the reality of the trouble of gender.
Dr. Pereñas, you've done extensive qualitative research on the lives of immigrant care workers. What are some of the unique issues around care work facing this population, and what does this workforce mean for care work in the United States?
So as Sarah noted, I'm a qualitative sociologist, and I've done field work on focusing on domestic workers, not just here in the US, but my last studies were based in Dubai and in Singapore. And so I want to go back to the question of indenture, right? And what is the experience of indenture like? And people who have not looked closely at their, have not talked to them, have basically reduced how we understand indenture to the structure that shapes the actual experience. And they see basically indenture as resulting in nothing else but subjugation. And so the assumption is, if you cannot quit your job, you are unfree. And because you're unfree, you must be somehow oppressed. But this equation, this formulation just omits and erases the agency of the people who are trapped by indenture. How does, so we have to see that indenture as a unequal relationship between an employer and an employee. And so the missing part then of how if we just reduce indenture to a structural oppression is we're not taking into account, well, how do employers manage their power over the domestic worker? So I think it's important then, what I've come to learn is that when we examine domestic work or care work, we shouldn't only look at the provider, but we should also look at the recipient. We should also look at the employers. And we also have to look at employers as those, negotiating the power they hold over other people. And what I've come to learn is there's actually some nice people out there, but I've come to learn that to be nice, to be a nice employer, you have to be very conscious because the structure of the situation makes you basically, like
it's easier to subjugate someone. I mean, you're giving so much power, right? That it's easy to just kind of overlook your power. And when you do, it's like you're more likely to subjugate someone. Like, oh, I'm just going to cancel their day off the last minute. It doesn't really mean anything to them. Or I'll just add a few extra tasks, even though their time is over. Or I won't really give them like a day off because their room is so nice. And so these things like, I've come to learn that it's easier to subjugate someone, that you actually have to be consciously not doing it and not taking advantage of the power you have. And so, so I've come to learn from studying domestic work across the world and looking at people who are indentured that it's really important to look at those who manage their indenture, and that you come to realize that the vast majority of them think they're really nice people. Like most employers think, I'm really such a good person and I treat this person so nice. And I'm like so much nicer than how my neighbor treats them. And it's amazing, right? But then you realize, like, then you look closely at how they're managing their domestic worker. You're like, nah, you're kind of an asshole. and so I think that answers the other question too, of what is missing in what we're talking about, where we don't talk enough about employers, and we don't teach employers how to manage domestic work. Most employers want to think they're nice, and they say they're nice because they see their domestic worker as a family member. Yes, that's the worst thing you can actually do. So I want to end there.
Yeah. It's like, I think for most jobs, when your boss says, we're like a family here, that's a problem.
Yes.
Dr. Randolph, what are some of the ways that Black feminist thought and Black feminists have reconceptualized, subverted, and even rejected care work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think what we're seeing now is and I had a conversation recently. I was at a conference, and the person said, I gave the example of Alice Walker, and I said, Alice Walker, when looking at all of her work, she really didn't. She was a mother to Rebecca Walker, but in surveying her motherhood journey, she really probably wanted to be a father. I would have been a good father. Or an uncle. I would have I would have been a good uncle. Like a father, especially in the 1970s, there's no one, there, and you have a girl, that's not a boy, you don't have to throw a ball with them or do anything like that. No. You can be lovingly present, but after the work is done, and everyone's going to make excuses for you to do that. I think some of the work that Alice Walker and other Black feminists have done, especially I would also say Black queer feminism, because that's really what's pulled me along, is in reimagining what family and care can look like, right? So yes, it can be which is typically several different women in the community who can help. That's one way of sharing the work that the state fails, and society, and all different, you're the front of the line and the back of the line, but also in reimagining, 9 fathers would be great. Right? like you get one decent mom out of 9 fathers. Like reimagining what like care could look like, right? And also at the same time, and I often see this because I also, study the carceral state, like thinking about abolition in the long term, so you can advocate for it and abolish the police and so forth. But then in the here and now, you want people to be able to have access to decent food and so forth, and those two things not being contradictory. And I think of that with the way many Black feminists are trying to understand, childcare, pre-pandemic childcare that would have, it doesn't exist like this anymore. Like it could, 6 to 6 or 7 to 7. I lived in Atlanta when I first had my son. You could have had him from 6 to 8. Not that any, that would have been hard, but you could have had it. And that's really fundamentally making people work longer. There's a push of capitalism, work more, that the pandemic somewhat disrupted. But looking at, and what does that mean if you can have your, child in childcare, there's someone who's having to be away from their child. And especially in Atlanta, there's a conversation with activists that's around building of Cop City and the decrease of childcare hours, which I thought was really interesting, connecting those. My son, he goes to an abolitionist school, and so he came home and I was like, now explain it to me. Like, what are you all doing? Like, and Free Gaza? What's going on? But really making the connection between the feminist issue of having those child care centers be 24 hours. And you don't see it as much. It's a creeping back, but it was a pre-pandemic child care centers. I don't know if it's in New York. It's definitely in Atlanta where you can have a child care center that can be open 12 hours. Or even if you want to go shopping, you can just bring your kid to it. Do they have that here? Yeah, you could just bring your kid to a child care center. You've never been there, but they feed them all types of things. But not just regulating, but unionizing those workers and so forth. So I think where I've seen the most interesting conversations have been the conversations that connect those coalitions to us and also to the carceral state and working conditions and abolition in general. Yeah.
Dr. Reynolds, you already touched on this a little bit, but I guess we can just keep expanding. So how are contemporary Black feminists reimagining care work? What issues are most important to the community right now?
Well, I don't know if I can speak. I mean, my work doesn't delve into that in general because I look a little bit at, I'm a legal historian, so I look at, and that's a very limited, area in which Black feminists tend to do work because that's not the only or the most effective place or been the most beneficial place of getting your needs or citizenship needs met. But in looking at the state and where Black feminists have been working on care work in terms of the labor activism. And also, this is what's interesting. I was recently worked with something, and I was like, whoa, this is with the internet and Black women's labor through sex labor. And that many of, I was working on a case with some people, and they really brought me along in this case. Women really, with the advent of the internet and Instagram, that they have more control over their sex work than they did before. Like, they can upload videos on their own. And it's also, we're living in a society where it's become a little bit more open. They can care for their children in the other room, but wanting to own more of the production of that. And so looking at that as also making easy allies. I like messy allies. You're both going for the same thing. You want to take care of your kid, right? So you want to have more money to do that, right? And so making easy allies with that, those group of women in that case who someone was taking over their domain that wasn't originally theirs, and making their arguments for being able to bring their kids to school, right? Being able to take care of their kids in another room while they continue to do a lot of the online work that, doesn't put their children in danger and so forth. And so seeing that as also feminist labor that, can be championed or protected.
Dr. Amador, you spoke a little bit earlier, and you've written about how your family inspired your interest in labor history. How do issues like class and sort of where people come from impact how historians approach the field?
Absolutely. So when I first became interested in domestic work, thinking about it in a scholarly way, when I was in college. I'm a first-generation college student, and I took a class where there was some information about domestic workers at Sarah Lawrence College, which is not very far from where we are now. And my grandmother had worked in that area, right, in Bronxville, Scarsdale, that whole region as a domestic worker from Puerto Rico in the 1940s. And I was taking care of kids as a way to help pay my way through school. So I was doing a lot of care work myself and calling her on the phone and having these long conversations, right, during she was like my rock. She had retired back to Puerto Rico, and I was telling her, like, I'm taking care of these kids, I'm doing my homework, and, we're talking about domestic workers. Can I interview you for my project? And she said, yeah. And she said, you can also talk to my friends, And I started talking to them about what it was like for them to have come in the 40s and the 50s to New York and to do this work, and kind of how isolating it was, but also how exciting it was to be in a new place and to build new lives. And how they had such varied experiences also of their labor experience. So what I realized right away was that it could go down really different ways for different people. And the stories that came across immediately were so powerful of, the pain of not raising one's own children, of the vulnerability of being, in a place where you could be sexually assaulted, where you could, you didn't have control over the terms of your labor. All of this story was so much there. But also what I realized from the personal experience of seeing my grandmother's story was just how much we had lost because of this extraction of her from the place where she was from, right? That she wasn't able to live in Puerto Rico. She wasn't able to live her life on the farm where she wanted to be. And that we had all moved, right? And that we grew up in this kind of migration for generations because of this displacement. So I really felt that extraction, both of the kind of class and the racialized aspect of what it means to be Puerto Rican, what it means to be the kind of child of this colonized diaspora, is about, not also the loss. And for her, that loss was a lot about not being able to raise her own children. And I think she felt that kind of pressure and that pain of the societal kind of, that she had been a bad mother, but also her children in turn had also been critical of her for having made that choice. And that was really painful. And I think that just that whole structure, growing up and living through that and thinking about that, and then becoming a mother myself and having to make choices about, am I gonna write my book with my baby under the table, or am I gonna get childcare? What's it gonna look like? Right, I think that it impacts us so deeply. And the class experience of having seen generations of women in my family struggle with how to balance that and how to live that and how much is extracted from them has profoundly shaped my work. And I think it really is so important to keep asking those questions about, how can we think about what's already been said on the panel, right? How can we think about employers in that frame? How were they benefiting, but also, how she was so pained by the fact that once she stopped employment, they weren't contacting her, they weren't helping her, she didn't have Social Security that she had, all of these challenges that once she was an elder, it wasn't over for her. She was still living. Or that question of what does it mean to have your identity so linked to care and motherhood, and how does that psychologically create also kind of trauma through the generations that we have to live with. But also possibilities in other ways, right? Because she was also, I think through talking to me and through our conversations about it, it was also really powerful to see how much she envisioned a different way that it could be. And I think if you talk to domestic workers and you talk to poor women who have grown up doing this work, they can tell you what they need, right? It's also not that people don't have the intellectual, philosophical capacity to say and to critique the capitalist structures that we live in. So if we can listen to people about what they have experienced, we might be able to envision that alternative.
Dr. Prinas, I'm going to ask you our last question of the panel. So Immigrants make up a large segment of the domestic care workforce, both in the United States and worldwide. What are some of the trends that you expect to see around that workforce in the next few decades?
So, so I should note that in the United States, people could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure in the United States, most domestic workers are actually native born, and it's because, or care workers, I should say, are mostly native born, and most of them are actually doing, state subsidized home care, and that they're providing care for their relatives. And so what you do see in the United States is a lot of isolated individuals who are not getting sufficient care because they don't have the material resources to do it. So they have someone come into their household like once a week, and so they have very lonely existences, and so while that's the case, domestic migrants are actually, definitely overrepresented in the domestic in the domestic work labor force. And this state, the U.S., I do not think is going to recognize domestic work anytime soon as real labor. And despite the work of the National Domestic Worker Alliance and the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And so because of that, they're not going to recognize domestic workers with a visa to work here legally. And so I think that you will still continue to have this trend of most migrants doing this work coming in as undocumented workers, and that as undocumented workers, they're criminalized. And as undocumented workers, then they are some of the most vulnerable to abuse, including wage theft. So I do think that it is a priority for us to support organizations like the National Domestic Worker Alliance and to help them continue the work in the legal recognition of domestic work as real work. And I think one of the most important things we need to do is to help undocumented domestic workers legalize their status.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm honored by your expertise, and thank you for doing this panel. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.